The year was 1943 and a young lad named Thomas Pierce had just gotten word that he'd be shipped out to fight overseas in the raging World War II, and as much as he tried to convince himself that this was for King every day aboard the ship, Thomas wrote a letter. At first, his letters had been filled with bravado and even humor. A Red Cross worker was sorting through some of the personal effects of the fallen soldiers at an American field hospital that had been converted into a makeshift morgue. It sat on the kitchen table, big and heavy, and nobody knew what to do with it. Finally, Thomas's sister, Martha, broke the silence. "We should open it," she said, her voice shaking. Everyone looked at her, then at the box, and finally back at Martha. Mrs. Pierce began to cry, so Martha stopped and embraced her, whispering words of comfort. Meanwhile, Mr. Pierce went out to the shed to calm down. They read the letters out loud, taking turns, each one adding their own unique interpretation to Thomas's words. They read about his homesickness and his fear, about his love for Mary and his pride in his service. Each one was a piece of their son, their brother, their loved one, and together they formed a portrait of a young man who, despite the horrors he'd seen and the fear he'd felt, had never given up hope. Hope of returning home, hope of seeing his family again, and hope of reuniting with Mary and starting a family of his own. They read about how he missed his family and how much he loved them, about how he dreamed of coming home and starting a family of his own. Finally, Martha spoke, her voice trembling. "He never got to come home," she whispered. No one answered. There was no need. They all knew it was true. Thomas had died believing he would come home. But he never did, and in a way, that was the most heartbreaking part of all, about how he wanted to make his parents proud and how he wished he could tell them all this in person. Suddenly, a loud crash startled him. He jumped and turned around to see what had happened, and that's when he noticed the box. There was a palpable change in energy, a feeling of sadness mixed with hope. They'd read every single letter Thomas had ever written, but they'd also learned something else. They'd learned that their son, their brother, was gone forever. The war had taken him from them, body and soul, and no amount of letters, no matter how loving or well written, could bring him back. It was lying on its side and the lid was slightly ajar. He approached it cautiously, afraid of what he might find, then reached inside and pulled out a stack of letters. They were yellowed with age and tied together with twine, just like the others, but these were different. This wasn't a stack of letters. It was a bundle, a large, hefty bundle of unopened mail. His parents, unable to bear the thought of seeing their son's things, shook their heads. But Martha insisted. Everyone stared at it, unsure of what to do next. Finally, Mr. Pierce spoke. "I think we should read them," he said, his voice cracking. And so they did. They read as the sun rose and fell, as the birds sang and the wind rustled through the trees. They read through the morning and afternoon, through the evening and night, until finally, just before dawn, they finished the last letter. She wanted to know what Thomas had been up to, what he'd seen, what he'd done. Maybe these letters, this box, would somehow help fill the gaping hole in their hearts that had been there since he'd gone off to war. Among these belongings, she came across a sea chest bearing the name Pierce on the side. The pages were stiff and brittle, having spent years folded in half and stored tightly in the box. It was to their parents, and in it, Thomas told them about his life on the ship, how he'd met his bunkmates, Jimmy and Harry, and how he'd been missing his mother's apple pie. Then there was a letter to John. In it, Thomas gave his older brother tips on how to repair the roof in the barn and teased him mercilessly about his upcoming wedding. There were letters to Mary too, full of longing and love, and even a few to their youngest sibling, little Lily. In them, Thomas promised to bring his baby sister back, a doll from France, and finally, there was a letter to his mother and father. It was the last one he'd written, and in it, he told them how close he was to coming home and how excited he was to see them both again. But the words that filled them were anything but. They were alive with the energy of youth, the optimism of a young man. They hadn't realized that Thomas had written so much, so often, and certainly not about them. They felt a surge of pride mixed with grief. Pride because their son was so thoughtful and caring, and grief because they knew they'd never hear his voice again. And the power of Thomas's love for his family and friends. As she opened it, she found stacks and stacks of letters tied up with string and sealed with wax, each one painstakingly crafted and clearly very important to the young soldier who'd owned them, unable to bear the thought of these precious missives being lost or destroyed. The woman made sure to mark the box clearly and have it sent to the family it belonged to as soon as she possibly could. He'd written about how he was a hero and how he'd saved the day several times over, but now, faced with the true horrors of war, his tone had changed to one of desperation and fear. Still, he refused to let go of hope, writing about how close the end was and how he couldn't wait to get back home to them. He wrote one to his mother, and father too, to his older siblings who were running the family farm back home. And even one to his sweetheart Mary, whom he hoped with all his heart would still be waiting for him when he returned. In these letters he wrote about everything that went on around him, how he felt what he saw, and most importantly he wrote about his undying love for each and every one of them, promising to return and see them all soon. He wrote as if he already was back, telling his mom how nice it had been to see her again, or teasing his brother John about his latest girlfriend. All the while, he kept these letters hidden away in his sea chest until he could get back to England. For Thomas, they were mementos, tangible pieces of the life he left behind that helped keep him going when the realities of war threatened to overwhelm him, and country, that he was doing his duty, and all of those other patriotic platitudes. The honest truth was that Thomas was absolutely terrified. He didn't want to go, but being only 18 years old, he didn't have much of a choice in the matter. And so, as his ship set sail, he decided to do something that would help ease the pain of leaving everything and everyone he loved behind. But as time wore on and the war raged on, Thomas became more and more unsettled. Then one day, Thomas was killed in action. His body was never recovered but a few months later as the war in Europe drew to a close, and so a few weeks later, the box arrived at the Pierce family home. And so Martha opened the box. Inside were thousands of letters, yellowed with age and tied together with twine. Martha cleared her throat and began to read the first letter aloud. As Martha read the words, the family listened intently, their faces pale and drawn. Mr. and Mrs. Pierce exchanged a look after reading through dozens of letters. They took a break. He carried it back into the house and placed it on the table. By this point, the family had gathered together on the floor around the table, holding on to each other for dear life. But as the final letter came to an end, the mood in the room shifted. All in all, there were 764 letters, one for every day that Thomas had been away. As the final letter ended, the family was silent for a moment, absorbing the words and the implications of the message.